He had nothing, no bed, no home, no safety for his little boy. But when a homeless single father leapt into freezing waters to save a billionaire heiress, he didn't know it would shatter the walls around her heart forever. Before we dive in, drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will absolutely blow your mind. The Hudson was a cruel friend in January, its surface a sheet of black glass fractured only by the restless bite of wind. Beneath the iron bridge, Ethan Cole adjusted the frayed blanket around his son's shoulders, tucking it tight like a ritual he'd perfected in the dark. Noah's eyelids fluttered, half asleep, his small body curled against the wall of the underpass. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from the boy's forehead and whispered, "I'll be back in a minute, champ. Just stay warm." He straightened, his joints stiff from years of hard ground and harder choices, and walked toward the water's edge with a dented grocery bag in hand. A veteran at 34, a janitor when the world allowed, a homeless man always, Ethan scavenged with quiet precision, broken bottles, old wrappers, nothing useful. His breath rose in clouds as he muttered, "Come on, just a little something for him, though he knew the river never bargained. Then it came, the sound. A scream, high and raw, ripped through the cold night like glass shattering. Ethan froze, heart kicking against his ribs. A splash followed, violent, final, water swallowing something heavy. Without a thought, he dropped the bag and sprinted. Boots skidding on ice, he reached the railing and leaned over. The current swirled below, furious and unforgiving. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then a pale arm broke the surface, flailing once before vanishing. "Dad?" Noah's voice echoed behind him, frightened and small. Ethan didn't answer. His body had already decided. He vaulted the rail and hit the water like a stone. The cold was a fist around his chest, crushing, merciless. His lungs screamed as the current dragged him under, spinning him in the dark. Training buried in muscle memory forced him forward, arms cutting through liquid ice. Then he saw her, a young woman tangled in the river's grip, gown heavy with water, hair spreading like seaweed around her pale face. "Hold on," Ethan gasped, though she couldn't hear. He fought the drag, wrapped his arm around her waist, and kicked upward. Every stroke felt like knives against his skin, but slowly, painfully, they rose. His head broke the surface. He coughed, gasped, dragged her with him toward the jagged embankment. By the time he pulled her onto the rocks, his vision blurred with frost. She was limp, her lips blue, her body too light for someone so tall. Ethan collapsed beside her, chest heaving, the river still clawing at his boots. Noah appeared moments later, his blanket slipping from his shoulders, eyes wide with terror and awe. "Dad was," he cried, kneeling by the stranger. "Is she?" "She's alive," Ethan rasped. His trembling fingers pressed against her neck until he found it, the fragile flutter of a pulse. Relief shot through him, sharp and dizzying. He yanked off his own jacket, still damp from river spray, and draped it over her. The fabric smelled of smoke and street dust, but it was warmth, and right now warmth was all that mattered. Noah leaned close, his breath fogging in the air. "She looks like a princess," he whispered. Ethan studied the woman's face, delicate features slack with unconsciousness. Even drenched, even broken by the river, there was something unmistakable about her, the kind of beauty you only saw in photographs, on billboards, behind glass too thick for ordinary people to touch. But here she was, fragile as any life, her fate resting in the calloused hands of a man who slept under bridges. He had no idea who she was, no idea that her name, Madison Ward, was spoken in boardrooms and splashed across magazine covers, no idea that her father controlled half the city skyline, or that saving her would pull him out of the shadows he'd built to survive. All Ethan knew in that moment was the rise and fall of her chest beneath his jacket, the sound of Noah's anxious breathing, and the burn of river water still seared into his lungs. He pressed his palm gently against her forehead, whispering hoarsely, "Stay with us." And in the silence that followed, the city seemed to hold its breath too, unaware that on this bitter January night, a single act of instinct had just set two lives on a collision course neither of them could have imagined. The world blurred into chaos the moment the sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights painted the iron bridge in violent strokes, flickering against the black water still thrashing below. Paramedics spilled from the ambulance in a rush of heavy boots and clipped voices, their urgency a language Ethan hadn't heard since the battlefield. He tried to push himself upright, but his body refused. The river had stolen all the heat from him, leaving his skin the color of ash, lips trembling with a blue that belonged to the dead more than the living. "Hypothermic," one paramedic barked. "Get him in now." Another knelt beside Madison, brushing wet hair from her face. "No pulse irregularities." "She's shallow, but steady. Let's move, let's move." Ethan's eyes found Noah, small and frightened. The boy's blanket clutched around his shoulders like armor. His son was tugging at his sleeve with all the strength he had, desperate to keep him tethered. "Dad, don't let go," Noah pleaded, his voice shaking as much as his hands. Ethan forced a weak smile, though his body was collapsing inward. He tried to answer, to tell Noah it would be fine, but his jaw locked, teeth chattering too violently for words. The paramedics pried at his fingers, trying to free him from his son's grip, but Noah held tighter, small knuckles white, eyes wide with terror. "He rides with me," Ethan managed, his voice rough, guttural, as though dragged across gravel. The paramedic glanced between them, irritation softened by pity. "Fine, both of you. Just hurry." They lifted Ethan onto a gurney. His body felt weightless and unbearably heavy at the same time, every muscle screaming in protest. His vision tunneled, first the night sky above, fractured by sirens, then Noah climbing into the ambulance with him, blanket trailing, eyes refusing to blink as if blinking might make his father disappear. Madison was already strapped down inside, her gown plastered to her frame, skin pale against the sterile white sheets. She looked less like a woman than a ghost pulled too soon from the water. Ethan, barely conscious, registered only fragments, her hair spread like gold wires, her lips parting, her chest rising shallow and uneven. And then, impossibly, her eyes opened. It wasn't long, just a sliver of awareness. But in that moment, in that narrow crack between life and unconsciousness, she looked directly at him. Not the paramedics bustling around, not the equipment flashing, not the chaos. Him. The man drenched, shaking, unfit to even hold his own son without trembling. Her gaze locked, weak but unbroken, and she whispered, "Don't leave him." The words scratched out of her throat, fragile and breaking, but they landed like thunder. Every medic in the ambulance stilled for a heartbeat, then resumed their work with renewed urgency. Ethan's chest seized, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something unfamiliar. It had been years since anyone had spoken about him like that, with command, with care, as if his survival mattered. Her eyelids fluttered once, twice, then closed again, her head rolling to the side as unconsciousness reclaimed her. The moment was gone. But the echo of it burned inside Ethan, like a coal refusing to die. The doors slammed shut, metal on metal. The sound reverberated through the small space, sealing them into a capsule of blinding lights and labored breaths. The ambulance lurched forward, tires squealing against slick asphalt. Inside, the paramedics called out vitals, wrapped blankets, inserted IVs. Noah sat pressed against Ethan's side, his small hand gripping his father's with a desperation no one dared pry apart. Ethan's body trembled so violently the stretcher rattled. He tried to focus on Noah, on the warmth of his son's hand, but the image of her eyes, blue-gray, fevered, and impossibly steady, wouldn't leave him. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't know that her father's empire touched nearly every corner of the city. All he knew was that a woman who had nearly drowned had looked at him, Onyamem, a man who had already been drowning for years, and said the words no one else had. "Don't leave him." The ambulance cut through the city, lights blazing, sirens screaming, carrying with it 3 lives that had collided by accident, by fate, or by something neither Ethan nor Madison could yet name. What Ethan didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know as his consciousness frayed at the edges, was that those words whispered through cracked lips were not temporary. They were a vow. From that night forward, Madison Ward would not let him disappear back into the shadows he had made his home. And for the first time in years, the darkness trembled. The hospital smelled of bleach and something colder, something that lived in the walls between beeping monitors and whispered prayers. Ethan lay beneath thin sheets, his body still quaking from the river's grip. An IV dripped steadily into his arm, each drop reminding him he was alive, though he didn't feel like it. His chest ached, his skin burned with the aftermath of hypothermia, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the water closing over him again. He wanted to sleep, but shame gnawed at him louder than exhaustion. It was only a matter of time before someone realized he wasn't like the other patients. He had no insurance card, no address, no one to list as an emergency contact except a 6-year-old boy who should never have to carry that kind of weight. Across the hall, Madison Ward's room buzzed with attention. He'd overheard the nurses whispering. Her name carried power, money, headlines. The Heiress of Ward Enterprises pulled half dead from the Hudson. Cameras already crowded outside the building. A near tragedy wrapped in silk and diamonds. And Ethan, the nameless man who had dragged her out, felt the press of dread closing in. When the story broke, they'd know he was homeless. They'd know he was raising Noah in the shadows of bridges and shelters. He imagined reporters spinning it, twisting him into something unworthy of touching her hand, let alone saving her life. Noah had fallen asleep hours earlier on a cot the nurses had reluctantly provided, his small form curled under a blanket too big for him. Ethan watched him with hollow eyes, guilt pressing heavy on his chest. His son deserved warmth, stability, something better than a father who scavenged for scraps and stumbled into accidents that made headlines. The hallway quieted as night deepened, the shuffle of nurses fading into occasional echoes. Ethan turned toward the window, trying to disappear into the pale city lights outside. And then, without warning, the door opened. At first he thought it was a nurse, but when the figure slipped inside, soft steps carrying her across the linoleum floor, his breath caught. Madison Ward stood there, her blonde hair damp from a recent wash, hanging loose and untamed around her shoulders. She wore the same thin hospital gown as everyone else, yet on her it seemed foreign, as though the world had dressed royalty in rags. Her bare feet made no sound against the tile. For all her wealth, she looked achingly human in that moment, frail, tired, but alive. She closed the door softly behind her and moved to the chair beside his bed. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. His throat clenched, words trapped between disbelief and instinct. He wanted to tell her she shouldn't be here, that the guards would panic, that her father would rage. But her eyes silenced him before he could form the thought. They were steady, unwavering, not the eyes of someone who had nearly drowned hours before, but the eyes of someone who had decided something unshakable. She lowered herself into the chair, folding her hands in her lap, and leaned forward as if confiding a secret. "I'm not leaving," she whispered, voice raw but certain. "You saved me. Now let me save you." The words hit him harder than the river. He stared at her, at the faint flush in her cheeks, at the way her hands trembled slightly as though her body still remembered the cold. He wanted to ask what she meant, why she would even think he was worth saving. He wanted to remind her that he was no one, a man invisible to the city except when sweeping its floors. But her gaze anchored him, refused to let him drift into excuses. Noah stirred in the corner, rolling over in his sleep, and Madison's eyes flicked toward him. For a moment something softened in her expression, a tenderness Ethan didn't expect from someone raised in marble halls. She looked back at Ethan, and for the first time since he'd pulled her from the water, he let himself believe she wasn't just grateful. She was determined. Outside the window, the city pulsed with restless lights, hungry reporters waiting for tomorrow's story. But inside the quiet of that hospital room, with antiseptic heavy in the air and the steady drip of the IV keeping him tethered, Ethan felt something shift. He didn't know what kind of storm her words would bring or how long she could keep her vow against the weight of the world pressing down on her. All he knew was that, for the first time in years, someone had looked at him not as a ghost of a man, not as a burden, but as someone worth staying for. He swallowed hard, his voice almost lost in the hum of machines. "Why?" he asked, not daring to look away. Her answer was simple, almost a breath. "Because I need to." And just like that, two worlds, one polished to a shine, the other buried in shadows, collided in the quiet of a hospital room, and neither of them would ever walk away the same. The room had gone quiet except for the faint rhythm of machines and the soft rasp of Ethan's breathing. Madison sat in the chair beside his bed, her hospital gown tugged awkwardly around her knees, her damp hair drying into loose waves. She had slipped past her guards hours ago and hadn't left, not even when nurses peeked in with raised brows. She said little, just sat there in the soft glow of the monitor, watching the man who had dragged her from the river fight his own war with exhaustion. It was then her gaze drifted to the corner of the room. Noah was curled in a chair, much too big for his small body, his head tipped against the armrest, a backpack tucked under his cheek like a makeshift pillow. His sneakers, the soles worn paper-thin, dangled just off the floor. His face was still soft with sleep, but Madison noticed the hollowness in his cheeks, the shadows that shouldn't exist on a child's skin. A pang tightened her throat. She had grown up with too much, sheets so fine they slipped like water, hallways echoing with music from teachers hired by the hour, more toys and tutors than she could ever remember. Yet in that corner sat a boy whose entire world was stitched together from scraps and a father's stubborn devotion. No diamonds, no trust funds, no cushion from the harshness of life. Just love. Stripped bare and relentless. Ethan stirred. His eyelids cracked open, heavy, and his gaze followed hers toward Noah. He pushed himself upright too quickly, grimacing at the pull of the IV. His jaw tightened when he saw the look on her face. "Don't," his voice was rough, threaded with shame, "don't look at him like that." "Like what?" "Like you feel sorry for him." He tried to straighten further, to reclaim some dignity from the sheets, but his body betrayed him. His shoulders slumped. "He doesn't need pity." Madison didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady. "I'm not pitying him, Ethan." Her voice was soft but sure, the kind that made people listen even when they didn't want to. "I'm noticing him." Ethan looked away, swallowing hard. He had grown used to people pretending Noah wasn't there, like the boy was invisible beside the man they judged. If anyone did look, it was only long enough to sneer at the worn clothes or shake their head at the unfairness of a child caught in a broken story. He braced himself for more of that now, but Madison's words were different, disarming. "He looks safe," she whispered, her eyes still on Noah. "When he's with you, he looks safe." That matters more than money. The words cut through him, not like a knife, but like sunlight through the thick fog he'd carried for years. He wanted to argue, to remind her of the nights he'd failed to find shelter, of the meals skipped so Noah could eat. He wanted to confess how often he felt like a failure, how shame sat on his shoulders heavier than his old army pack. But her sincerity stopped him. Safe. That word lodged deep in his chest. He thought of the bridges, the alleys, the shelters, of Noah's small hand gripping his in the dark. He thought of all the times he had wondered if his son would have been better off without him. And here was Madison Ward, a woman who had known nothing but opulence, saying the one thing he had never dared to believe, that love alone had kept his boy whole. He exhaled, long and unsteady, eyes closing, as if her words were too heavy to carry and too precious to let go. Madison stayed quiet after that, not pressing, not explaining herself. She simply sat in the silence she had created, a presence instead of a judgment. For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen, not as a man without a home, not as a charity case waiting to be fixed, but as a father, a flawed, weary, unpolished father who had given everything he had left to keep a boy safe in a world too cruel for him. And somehow, in the gaze of the woman he'd pulled from the river, that was enough. By morning, the hospital had become a stage. Reporters swarmed the sidewalks, cameras flashing in machine gun bursts as headlines spread across every channel. Aerys rescued by Mystery Man. The words were everywhere, on glowing screens in waiting rooms, whispered in elevators, plastered across tabloids already hot off the press. Madison Ward's face, pale but stunning, even in her hospital gown, filled the news cycle. But beside her, in every photograph, was the shadow of a man no one could identify. Ethan lay in his bed, the noise pressing through the walls like a storm he couldn't shut out. He had been invisible for years, and invisibility had been a kind of safety. Now strangers were clawing for his name, his past, his story. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging the blanket higher, every muscle tense with shame. He could already imagine it. Once they discovered he had no address, no polished history, no title beyond homeless veteran, they would twist the story until it broke him. The door burst open with a slam that rattled the metal frame. Richard Ward entered like a hurricane in a tailored suit. His voice carried the sharpness of boardrooms and the finality of verdicts. Madison. She was perched at Ethan's bedside, her hand resting lightly on the rail, as if her presence alone could anchor him. She turned slowly toward her father. "You shouldn't be here. I shouldn't—" His laugh was cold, incredulous. "You nearly drown, and when I finally get word, I find you sitting with this stranger?" His eyes cut toward Ethan like blades. "Who is he? What is he doing in your room?" Ethan lowered his gaze. Heat crawling up his neck. He wanted to disappear, to melt back into the shadows where no one asked questions. But Madison's voice rose before he could move. "He's the reason I'm alive," she said, clear and unwavering. Richard's jaw clenched. "Madison, listen to yourself. You're vulnerable, you're confused. We're moving you to a private clinic where the press can't exploit this circus." "I'm not leaving," she shot back. "You will, if I say so." Her eyes blazed, the same eyes Ethan had seen steady even as she trembled from the cold river. "Then if I leave, he comes too." The room went still. Even the machine seemed to pause. Ethan's head snapped up, stunned, his chest tightening, as though her words had struck something buried. "You can't be serious," Richard hissed. "You're aligning yourself with—" He stopped short, aware of the cameras flashing in the hallway, reporters straining for a glimpse. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "This man will ruin you." Madison didn't flinch. She stood, her hospital gown hanging awkwardly, but her presence regal, undeniable. "No, Father. He saved me. What ruins people isn't who rescues them. It's forgetting gratitude. It's forgetting truth." Ethan wanted to speak, to tell her not to tether herself to him, not to risk her name for someone the world would dismiss with a single headline. But the words caught in his throat. She was already standing for him, already fighting battles he'd never dared dream someone might fight on his behalf. The standoff spilled into the corridor, and the press caught everything. Her refusal, his threats, Ethan's silence. Photographs of the heiress choosing to side with a nameless man flew across the city within the hour. A billionaire's daughter and a homeless stranger. It was unthinkable, scandalous, irresistible. Yet in the eye of the storm, the noise dimmed. Ethan looked at Madison, bewildered, searching for the reason behind her defiance. She met his gaze, steady, almost serene. It wasn't pity in her eyes, not obligation, but something firmer, something that felt like a vow. And for the first time, as the world outside spun with flashing cameras and hungry voices, Ethan sensed the truth neither of them could deny. Somehow, in the darkness of that river and the quiet of this room, They had forged a connection no storm could easily tear apart. The nights in the hospital stretched like long corridors without doors. Time didn't move the way it did outside, where traffic pulsed and city lights blinked in restless patterns. Here, the hours blurred, marked only by the hum of fluorescent bulbs, the soft shuffle of nurses, and the distant echo of wheels on linoleum floors. Madison stayed, slipping past her guards with practiced ease, settling into the same chair by Ethan's bed as if it belonged to her now. She didn't fill the space with nervous chatter. Instead, she asked questions that no one else ever thought to ask, the kind that pried open corners Ethan had long kept sealed. "What was Noah like when he was born?" she asked one evening, her voice soft, as though she knew the answer might carry more weight than the walls could hold. Ethan shifted against the pillows, eyes heavy but awake. "Small," he said, a tired smile tugging at his mouth. "Too small." His fist barely wrapped around my finger, but he was loud, cried like he'd already figured out the world owed him something. He paused, his smile fading. Rachel, his mother, she didn't make it through. Complications. One minute I was holding his hand, the next I was holding hers as she slipped away. Silence fell, not the kind that suffocated, but the kind that demanded reverence. Madison didn't offer apologies or empty comforts. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on him like the words deserved to be carried, not smoothed over. Ethan swallowed hard, continuing as if the dam had finally cracked. After that, it was just me and Noah. I tried to work, but my body... He flexed his hand, remembering the way shrapnel had left its scars deep beneath the skin. The war took more than I thought. Laid me off from the factory when I couldn't keep up. Then one job after another. Every time I thought I'd built something, it slipped away. Rent notices piled up, then came the eviction. Before I knew it, bridges and shelters became home. He said it flatly, without drama, but his eyes betrayed the weight. Years of carrying shame like a second skin. Madison leaned forward, her voice steady. And through all that, you still kept Noah safe. He looked at her then, startled by the conviction in her tone. Most people only saw the failure, the ragged edges, but she saw the thread he had fought not to let go of, his son. Later, when the quiet stretched again, it was Madison's turn. She stared at the floor, her hands twisted in her lap. "You know what's strange? I've never really been asked who I am. People ask what I own, what I'm planning, what I'll inherit, but not who." Ethan watched her, saying nothing, letting her words unfurl. "My whole life has been boardrooms and headlines. Private tutors who smiled because they were paid to. Friends who liked me because of invitations to galas. Every man who's ever looked at me saw Ward Enterprises stamped across my face. Never me, just the cage I was born into." She laughed, but it was bitter, hollow. "Sometimes I think the world has loved my reflection more than my heart." Ethan studied her, the woman who had everything but sounded like she had nothing. "Sounds lonely," he said quietly. Her eyes lifted to his, surprised by the simplicity of the observation. "It is," she admitted. And just like that, something fragile passed between them, two stories told in different languages but carrying the same ache. His was carved by loss and survival, hers by isolation and expectation. Both bruised, both tired, both longing for something beyond what the world had handed them. They sat in that shared silence, walls crumbling, not with declarations, but with honesty. Ethan realized he wasn't ashamed in her presence, and Madison realized she wasn't invisible in his. The hospital faded away, the antiseptic, the reporters outside, the storm waiting beyond the glass. In the quiet, it was only them, two broken souls seeing themselves reflected, not in perfection, but in pain. And for the first time in years, both dared to believe that maybe broken was not the end of the story. The morning light seeped weakly through the narrow hospital blinds, painting thin stripes across the floor and the edges of the bed. The world outside was already alive with the chaos of reporters and cars, but inside the room there was only stillness, a fragile cocoon carved out of exhaustion and antiseptic air. Noah stirred in the oversized chair where he'd fallen asleep, his blanket twisted around him, his cheek marked with the faint crease of fabric. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, the days of sleep still clinging to him. When his gaze landed on Madison, he froze. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him, her hospital gown draped awkwardly, a stolen pen in her hand, and his coloring book balanced across her lap. Her hair was loose and uncombed, falling across her shoulders, but her brow was furrowed in the intense concentration of a child. She didn't notice he was awake at first. She was too busy sketching something with deliberate strokes, tongue pressed between her teeth like she was trying to get it right. Noah leaned forward, curiosity cutting through his shyness. "What are you doing?" His voice was still hoarse from sleep, small but steady. Madison glanced up, startled, then smiled faintly. "I hope you don't mind. I borrowed your book. I've never been good at drawing, but I thought I'd try." She tilted it toward him. A castle filled the page, crooked towers and lopsided windows, but her lines had intention, and at the center, two great doors stood wide open. "Why are the doors like that?" Noah asked, his head tipping to the side. "So no one ever feels locked out," she said softly. "What's the point of a castle if the people who need it most can't get inside?" For a moment he just stared at her, his small fingers twisting in the edge of his blanket. Then, unexpectedly, the corners of his mouth curved upward. A short, surprised laugh escaped him, bubbling like something he hadn't realized he still remembered how to make. His shoulders shook with it, unguarded and pure, and it filled the room with a sound Ethan hadn't heard in far too long. From the bed, Ethan went still. His chest tightened in a way that almost hurt, because that laugh, it had been weeks, maybe months since he'd heard it. Not since Rachel, not since the weight of loss had silenced the brightness in his boy's face. He swallowed hard, his eyes stinging as he watched his son laugh again, watched Madison laugh with him, her own smile breaking open like sunlight. Noah leaned closer, pointing at the towers she had drawn. "They're not straight," he teased, grinning now. "Of course they're not," Madison said, feigning indignation. "Have you ever seen a straight castle? They're all a little crooked. It's what makes them stand." That sent Noah into another fit of laughter, his shoulders shaking as he tucked his face into the blanket. When he looked up, his eyes were brighter, a spark returning that Ethan had been afraid was gone forever. Ethan couldn't move. He just lay there, silent, his heart aching in a way that wasn't entirely pain. Gratitude filled him so fiercely it almost choked him. He wanted to say something, to thank her, but the words tangled in his throat. He knew what that moment meant. She had given him back something he thought he'd lost, his son's smile. Madison glanced at him then, her eyes meeting his. For a breath, the world outside didn't exist. Not the cameras, not Richard Ward, not the storm waiting to break. Just her, sitting cross-legged with a coloring book, and the boy who was finally laughing again. And in her gaze was something dangerous. Not pity, not even just kindness. It was hope, raw, alive, unyielding. The kind of hope that could rebuild castles from ashes, that could open doors long thought closed. Ethan felt it strike through him, both terrifying and electric, because hope was the one thing he had taught himself never to trust. But there it was, shining in her eyes, as if she'd carried it with her all along, waiting for someone else to believe. The meeting began behind closed doors, but Ethan could hear enough through the thin walls to know the decision had already been made. The voices of administrators, clipped and polished, carried the same tone he remembered from commanding officers, a final, unquestionable. They didn't want him here, not in their hospital, not in their headlines. He was a complication, a distraction, a shadow threatening the pristine image they wanted to project. When the door opened, their faces were careful masks of courtesy. One of them, a man with a tie knotted too tightly, stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole," he began, though the title sounded forced. "In light of recent publicity, we believe it's best if you recover elsewhere. Our resources are limited, and given your situation, it would be more appropriate for you to transition out of our care." Ethan stared at him, cold shame crawling up his spine. His situation. The word landed like a slap. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, veins still blue from the river's bite. He wanted to argue, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. They were right. He didn't belong here. He never did. Before he could answer, Madison rose from the chair beside his bed. Her gown swayed against her legs, her damp hair pulled into a loose braid, but her posture was sharp enough to slice through the room. "He's not going anywhere," she said, her voice clear. "Cutting." The administrators exchanged wary glances. "Miss Ward, we understand you're grateful." Grateful?" she snapped. "Grateful is a card and a handshake. This man dragged me out of a river with his own body. I'm breathing because of him. And you want to throw him onto the street." One of them shifted uncomfortably. "The press frenzy outside is becoming unmanageable. It's not good for the hospital's reputation." "Then let me handle it," Madison said. "If reputation is all you care about, I'll give you one." She turned without another word, striding to the door. Ethan's pulse hammered as he realized what she was about to do. "Madison," he rasped, trying to rise, but she stopped him with a single glance. Within minutes, the room was unrecognizable. Cameras crowded the space, reporters pressed shoulder to shoulder, microphones extended like weapons. The blinds rattled from the storm of flashes. Ethan sat frozen against the pillows, the thin blanket pulled over him, wishing he could disappear into the floor. Noah pressed himself into the corner, eyes wide, clutching his backpack to his chest. And Madison! Madison stood at his side, one hand resting firmly on the rail of his bed, her chin lifted like a queen holding court. The storm outside had become hers to command. "This man saved my life," she began, her voice unwavering over the chaos. The cameras clicked furiously, but she didn't flinch. "You keep asking me who he is. I'll tell you. He is the reason I am standing here. He is the reason I can breathe, the reason you're all gathered in this room instead of planning my funeral." Reporters shouted questions, but she raised a hand, silencing them. Her eyes blazed, not with desperation, but with defiance. "If he leaves this hospital, I leave with him." "That's not a threat, that's a fact. I don't care about headlines. I don't care about your polished statements. What I care about is truth. And the truth is, you don't throw away the hands that saved you just because they're rough or dirty, not while I have a voice to say otherwise." Ethan's chest tightened until it hurt. He had lived years in the shadows, ignored or dismissed by everyone who passed him on the street. And here was Madison Ward, daughter of the most powerful man in the city, tying her name, her reputation, her entire future to his in front of the world. He wanted to tell her to stop, to protect herself, but he couldn't. The lump in his throat was too heavy, his breath caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. The hospital administrators stood frozen at the back of the room, their careful composure cracking under the weight of her words. No one dared contradict her, not with the cameras rolling, not with the entire city watching. Ethan lowered his eyes, trembling, ashamed of the tears burning against the corners. He didn't deserve this. He had nothing to give her, nothing to offer but scars and failures. But Madison didn't care about any of that. She stood firm, her hand never leaving his bed, her gaze fierce and unflinching. And in that instant, Ethan understood something he had long forgotten. Sometimes salvation doesn't come in silence or secrecy. Sometimes it comes loudly, defiantly, with cameras flashing and the world forced to listen. And for the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. He was seen. The headlines arrived like a second winter, cold, relentless, and everywhere. By morning, the tabloids had cobbled his life into a narrative that fit neatly into the city's appetite for scandal. "Hero or hustler?" one screamed in block letters. Another ran a shadowy photo of him under the bridge with a caption that read, "Questionable past, questionable motives." The internet devoured it, fed on it, and spat it back out with teeth. Ethan woke to the glow of a phone someone had left on the bedside table. Messages stacked like kindling, angry, curious, speculative. He thumbed through them with fingers still shaky from the river's bite and found the worst underneath, inked in papers that smelled faintly of money. Articles quoting anonymous sources, leaked details that felt like knives. His discharge paperwork from the military had been dug out and printed in full. Stories of deployments, of a physical injury that never fully healed, of the layoffs that rattled his life. Someone had found an old court filing, a name repeated in eviction notices. They published a photograph of a much younger Ethan in uniform beside a grainy image of him wrapped in a blanket beneath a bridge. The juxtaposition was cruel in its simplicity. Soldier turned vagrant, savior turned suspect. He could almost hear Richard Ward's voice in every paragraph, the insinuation, the carefully placed doubt. Madison's father had the money and the motive to make digging feel like justice. To protect his daughter's empire, he'd weaponized the past. Ethan's stomach turned as strangers who had never met him rendered judgment with the kind of certainty reserved for jury rooms. Word reached the hospital in a torrent. Nurses shifted uneasily, glancing at him with new, thinly veiled curiosity. The look in their eyes wasn't pity so much as measurement. How long would the hospital tolerate this mess? How long before Madison's loyalty cost them more than they could bear? Noah woke to the whispering, to the shuffling coats and the furtive glances. He clung to Ethan's hand until the skin grew white. Ethan felt every headline like a personal exposure, a stripping. He had spent years building invisible walls, shame as mortar, so no one could see the cracked bricks beneath. The leaks tore those walls down in hours. He could not bear the thought of Madison's name dragged through the mud because of him. He had always been ready to be the one who lost. He had not trained himself to expect anyone to choose otherwise. That afternoon, when Madison came in wearing the same tired hospital gown and a face that had been bruised by sleep and fury in equal parts, he asked that she sit. The room felt small. He could no longer ignore the weight of her father's reach. "You don't see what this is doing," he said quietly, voice dense with effort. "They'll tear you apart. They'll make your life unbearable. You should go back to him. Go back to the life you had." Madison's eyes sharpened, but there was no anger in them, only a steadiness that had become frighteningly familiar. "You think I don't know that?" she asked. "Do you think I don't see the headlines?" "I can't be the reason you lose everything," he said, each word a plea and a wound. "I'm not worth the cost." She reached out, her hand finding his on the bed rail. Her fingers were cool but firm, a touch that had become a kind of sanctuary. "Ethan," she said softly, the syllable steady as a promise. "You saved me from the water. Let me save you from drowning in your shame." The words landed like a rescue line thrown over black water. And for a moment he only stared. He knew how to survive storms. He did not know how to accept a lifeline. Shame had taught him to push away anything that might complicate the neatness of his suffering. But Madison did not step back. She did not flinch. She stayed, steady as a lighthouse in a gale. "You don't have to do this alone," she added, quieter, as if revealing a secret meant only for him. "I don't care what they print. I care about you, about Noah, about the fact that you didn't think twice before pulling me out." He closed his eyes against the wave of something unfamiliar, relief, fear, gratitude, so loud it threatened to drown him. Outside, the city roared with opinion and outrage and speculation, but inside that small room, the only sound that mattered was the thrum of her conviction. Madison's refusal had a stubbornness that defied logic, and when she spoke, it rearranged the world around him. He wanted to say he didn't deserve her faith. He wanted to protect her from himself, to spare her the ugly excavation of his past. But her hand squeezed his, the pressure saying, what words could not. He swallowed, forced from his chest a breath that tasted like the river and like possibility. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine not surviving alone, but living with someone who chose him in spite of his history. The hospital had settled into its midnight rhythm, the kind of hush that made every sound sharper, every whisper heavier. Machines hummed, monitors blinked their steady warnings, and the world outside the glass seemed far away. Noah lay in the small cot they had squeezed into the corner of the room, his thin blanket tugged to his chin, his small feet sticking out from underneath. His backpack, stuffed with crayons and the few treasures he carried everywhere, sat propped against the wall like a silent guardian. Madison was the one kneeling beside him, not Ethan. She had slipped into the role without announcement, without asking permission, as though caring for him had been etched into her long before this night. She tucked the blanket closer, smoothing the wrinkles, her fingers gentle in a way that surprised even her. Noah's eyes were half closed, lashes heavy, but he lingered on the edge of sleep with the determination of a child who didn't want to let go just yet. "Can you stay with us forever?" he whispered, the words fragile, almost afraid to exist outside his lips. Madison froze. For a breath, the world stopped with her. She felt it catch in her chest, sharp and unsteady. Forever. The word rolled through her like a bell struck in a cathedral, echoing against places inside her she hadn't visited in years. Her throat tightened, but she leaned down anyway, brushing her hand through his hair, letting her fingers memorize the softness of strands that had only ever known hard pillows and restless nights. "As long as you want me to," she murmured, her voice breaking but sure. Noah's lips curled into a drowsy smile, the kind only children could wear, trusting, unguarded, whole. His breathing evened as sleep finally took him, his hand still clutching the corner of the blanket, as if holding her words there would keep them from vanishing. Ethan had been half asleep, his body still aching, his pride still raw, when he heard it. At first he thought he had dreamt it, that soft plea in his son's voice. But when Madison answered, her tone gentle and steady, it cut through him like a blade wrapped in velvet. He lay still, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, but his chest caved in around the weight of what he had just heard. Noah wanted what Ethan could not give. A family, permanence, something more than survival scraped together day by day. His son didn't crave riches or castles or headlines. He craved the one thing Ethan had failed to hold on to, a home that didn't leave, a presence that didn't fade. He had been strong for so long. Strong when Rachel died, strong when the eviction notice came, strong when Noah cried because the cold had crept into his bones at night. Strong when he had to choose between food and medicine, between dignity and survival. Strength had become his armor, his mask, his language. But hearing Noah's voice tonight, so small, asking for forever, asking Madison, not him, nearly shattered him. He turned his head, just enough to see them. Madison still sat there beside the cot, her hand resting lightly on Noah's shoulder even as he slept. Her eyes in the dim light shone with something fierce and tender all at once. She didn't look like a woman playing a part. She looked like someone who belonged there, someone who had been waiting to step into the space they hadn't even known was empty until she filled it. Ethan's throat burned. He pressed his lips together to keep the sound inside, but tears blurred his vision. He had spent years teaching himself to want less, to expect less, because wanting meant losing, and losing meant breaking. Yet here was his boy, brave enough to ask for the very thing Ethan had buried deep, the promise of a family, of someone who wouldn't walk away. And here was Madison, answering without hesitation. He shut his eyes, but the image lingered, branded against the dark. His son's plea, her vow. Two truths he had no power to hold, and yet, for the first time in a long while, Ethan wondered if maybe he wasn't meant to hold them alone. The morning of his discharge came gray and heavy, the kind of day where the sky itself seemed undecided. Nurses moved briskly through the halls, pushing carts, exchanging clipped greetings, but inside Ethan's room the air was thick with something heavier than hospital dust: dread. He sat on the edge of the bed, the thin paper packet of his discharge papers clutched in his hand. His boots, worn and cracked, rested awkwardly on the polished tile. He had nothing else to carry out of the hospital, nothing to mark his stay, except the quiet ache of shame, and the boy still curled against the chair with his blanket. The world outside the doors wasn't waiting with kindness. He'd overheard the nurses whispering, the orderlies murmuring in the halls. Photographers had camped on the sidewalks for days, cameras poised like rifles, eager for the shot that would tell them who he really was. They'd already carved him into headlines, hero or hustler, and now they wanted a picture to prove which story they believed. Madison stood by the window, her hospital gown traded for simple clothes, her hair pulled into a loose knot. She looked tired but certain, as though the noise outside only strengthened her resolve. When Ethan shifted, fumbling with the papers, she turned and said, "I'm walking you out." "You don't have to do that," he muttered, staring at the floor. "They'll be waiting." "It'll just make it worse." She stepped closer, her eyes steady. "Worse for who? Them or you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to protect her from the spectacle, but Noah stirred awake at that moment, rubbing his eyes, and looked at Madison the way children looked at the sun when they were sure it would rise again. Ethan swallowed his words. When the orderly arrived with the wheelchair, Ethan tried to wave him off, but his body betrayed him, legs still weak from the river's punishment. He lowered himself in reluctantly, gripping the arms of the chair until his knuckles whitened. Madison walked beside him, Noah perched on the edge of her hip, and together they moved through the fluorescent-lit corridor toward the glass doors that separated them from the storm outside. The moment the doors slid open, the flash bulbs exploded. A wall of sound hit them, shouts, questions, the click and pop of cameras capturing every angle. Ethan hunched instinctively, shrinking into himself. He had spent years teaching his body to take up less space, to go unseen. Now, under the weight of hundreds of eyes, he felt stripped bare, smaller than he'd ever been. And then Madison reached for his hand. Her fingers slid into his, firm and unflinching, and she lifted their joined hands so there was no mistaking it. The cameras caught everything. The Heiress and the homeless man, fingers laced together, stepping into the chaos, not as strangers bound by accident, but as something else entirely. Ethan froze, heat rushing through him, not from shame, but from the shocking strength of her grip. She wasn't pretending, wasn't performing. She was choosing. In front of the entire city, she was refusing to let him disappear back into the shadows. The crowd faltered for a moment. The shouted questions stuttered, softened, then shifted. Some reporters lowered their cameras, exchanging glances. Others whispered words Ethan could almost hear. Bravery, loyalty, love. For the first time since the headlines had begun, the story bent under its own weight. Not scandal, not spectacle. Admiration. Ethan kept his head down, but his eyes flicked to Noah. The boy's mouth was curved in the faintest smile, pride glowing in the space where fear used to live. Madison gave his hand another squeeze, grounding him, reminding him that this was no longer a walk he had to take alone. By the time they reached the car waiting at the curb, the story had already rewritten itself. Not hero or hustler, but something no one had expected. A woman who had everything holding on to a man who had nothing, and making the world believe that maybe, just maybe, nothing was enough. Ethan sank into the seat, heart pounding, eyes burning for more than the flash of cameras. Madison settled beside him, still holding his hand. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at him, and in her gaze was a quiet vow, one the city had just witnessed, one Ethan could no longer deny. That single gesture had changed everything. Snow had begun to fall again, light flakes drifting down as if the sky itself was exhausted. Ethan stood at the edge of the gravel drive, staring at the small guest house tucked behind Madison's estate. Warm light glowed through the curtained windows, soft and steady, but it felt unreal, like something out of a dream he wasn't meant to touch. He shifted Noah's backpack higher on his shoulder, the weight familiar, grounding. His son clung to his side, breath puffing white in the bitter air, eyes wide with quiet wonder. Madison was already at the door, her coat pulled tight around her. She turned, smiling gently. "Come inside, you'll both freeze out here." Ethan hesitated. Every muscle in his body resisted. He had slept under bridges, in shelters that smelled of bleach and despair, in alleys where shadows were safer than strangers. He knew where he belonged, and it wasn't here, on manicured land owned by a woman who had never wanted for anything. "This isn't right," he muttered, his voice low. "We don't belong in a place like this." Madison stepped closer, her gaze steady, unflinching in the cold. "You belong here more than anyone," she said softly, "because you've known what it's like to have nothing. This house isn't about privilege, it's about safety, and you deserve that, Ethan. Noah deserves that." Her words struck him like a chord, but the fear still clung to his ribs. He looked down at his son, at the boy's shoes worn thin from too many miles, at the way his cheeks were flushed from the cold. Noah didn't say anything, just tugged at his father's sleeve with a small, hopeful hand. That was all it took. Ethan exhaled, long and heavy, and followed Madison to the door. Inside, warmth wrapped around them immediately. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old books. The space wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a fireplace crackling softly, but it felt alive. Madison had thought of everything. A basket of blankets folded neatly by the couch, shelves stacked with puzzles and storybooks, a tray of food waiting on the counter, steam curling into the air. Noah's eyes lit up. He darted toward the bedroom Madison pointed out for him. The bed was made with thick quilts, the kind that promised warmth even in the deepest winter. He climbed onto it, bouncing lightly before burying his face in the pillow. "Dad," he whispered, muffled but filled with awe. "It's soft." Ethan's throat tightened. For the first time in years, his son was going to sleep in a bed that wasn't shared with strangers, wasn't hard with stone or echoing with fear. He leaned against the doorway, watching Noah curl into the blankets, small shoulders finally unburdened by cold. But relief battled uneasily with something darker inside him. Standing in that room, he felt like an intruder in someone else's life. The polished wood floors, the gleam of clean sheets, the hum of a working heater. It all felt borrowed, temporary, too fragile to trust. He imagined the day they would be asked to leave, the sting in Noah's eyes when the softness was taken away again. He braced himself against it even now, as though expecting kindness to vanish was the only way to survive it. Madison seemed to sense the storm inside him. She stepped quietly into the room, her voice lowered so only he could hear. "Ethan," she said, her hand brushing his arm lightly, "you don't have to feel guilty for this. It isn't charity. It's not pity. It's just what's right." He turned to her, his eyes shadowed, his jaw tight. "I've spent so long being told I don't belong anywhere. It's hard to believe this is different." Her gaze held his, unwavering. "Then let me believe it for you, until you can." Ethan said nothing, afraid that if he spoke, the walls he'd built would collapse completely. He only looked back at his son, who was already drifting into sleep, his small chest rising and falling in the rhythm of safety. The fire crackled in the other room. Snow continued to fall outside, and though the warmth pressed in from every corner, Ethan couldn't shake the chill that had lived inside him for years. He wanted to believe Madison's words. He wanted to believe he belonged, but fear still lingered, whispering that shadows were safer than light. The guest house smelled faintly of wood smoke and simmering broth, a scent that clung to the air like comfort. The storm outside had quieted, leaving the windows fogged from the warmth within. Ethan moved with slow efficiency in the small kitchen, stirring the pot of soup on the stove. It wasn't much. Vegetables salvaged from a market run, a loaf of bread wrapped in paper on the counter, but it was hot, and it was theirs. Madison sat at the small wooden table, watching the scene unfold with a quiet kind of wonder. She had eaten in dining rooms large enough to echo, with silver cutlery polished so fine it caught the reflection of chandeliers, yet nothing in those gilded rooms had ever smelled or felt like this. Noah sat across from her, swinging his legs under the chair, humming some tune only he knew. His hair was mussed, his cheeks flushed from warmth rather than cold. Every so often he'd glance toward Ethan and grin as though this moment was a secret only the two of them shared. Ethan ladled soup into chipped bowls, setting one in front of Madison, then Noah, then himself. He tore the bread into thick pieces with his hands, passing it around. There were no place settings, no folded napkins, no poured wine. Just soup, bread, and 3 people gathered around a table that had been empty for too long. At first they ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and Noah's occasional hum. But then Noah leaned forward, eyes bright. "Dad, remember the time we tried to make pancakes and you burned every single one?" Ethan groaned, rubbing his forehead. "You're never going to let me live that down, are you?" Noah giggled. "You said they were extra crispy." He looked at Madison and whispered conspiratorially, "They were basically black." Madison laughed, the sound slipping out before she could stop it. It startled her, not because it was unusual, but because it felt so unguarded. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head. "I can't picture you burning anything, Ethan." "Don't encourage him," Ethan muttered. But his lips betrayed him, curving into a reluctant smile. His eyes softened as he looked at Madison, as though the sound of her laughter had unlocked something he'd been afraid to touch. The conversation meandered after that, drifting like smoke. Noah told stories about drawings he wanted to finish, about how he wanted to build a treehouse someday, about how the soup reminded him of something his mom used to make even though he barely remembered her. Madison listened with a patience she didn't know she had, nodding, smiling, asking questions. Ethan, for his part, spoke little, but he didn't need to. His steady presence filled the spaces between their words, anchoring the table. He watched Noah with quiet pride, watched Madison with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, and though he said nothing, the warmth in his gaze was louder than any toast. Madison found herself leaning into it, into the simplicity. There was no performance here, no need to impress or be impressed. The soup was unevenly seasoned, the bread a little stale, the table worn with scratches, but the laughter that bubbled between spoonfuls was richer than any gala applause. She felt it in her chest, a weight shifting, a clarity she hadn't expected. Home wasn't chandeliers or marble floors. It wasn't the shine of crystal glasses or the perfection of a plated course. Home was this. It was Noah's giggle, spilling across the table like sunlight. It was Ethan's steady presence, his silence that never felt empty, his eyes that seemed to say more than his words ever did. It was the way the air itself seemed to soften around them, as though the world outside had been shut out just for this one evening. When dinner was done, Noah yawned and shuffled off to bed, dragging his blanket with him like a cape. Ethan began clearing the bowls, but Madison reached out, catching his hand. "Leave it," she said gently. "Sit with me a minute." He hesitated, then lowered himself back into the chair. The fire popped softly in the hearth. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Madison looked at him, really looked, and whispered, "I think this is the best dinner I've ever had." Ethan frowned, almost disbelieving. "Soup and bread?" She smiled, shaking her head. "No, you and Noah." The words lingered, hanging in the air like a vow neither of them dared name. For the first time in her life, Madison realized that belonging wasn't something marble could buy. It was something built, piece by fragile piece, at a small wooden table with soup, bread, and laughter that felt like it might never end. The storm came late, not in the sky, but in the house. Richard Ward arrived without warning, his driver leaving the engine idling in the long gravel drive as if he knew his master wouldn't stay long. The knock wasn't polite. It was the pounding of a man who had built empires by forcing doors open. Madison met him in the guest house living room, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Ethan was in the kitchen, drying dishes from dinner, while Noah hummed softly in the other room, arranging crayons in neat rows. The moment Richard stepped inside, the air thickened. His coat was still dusted with snow, his tie knotted too perfectly, his face carved in fury. "What is this?" he demanded, gesturing broadly at the small space. "You've reduced yourself to this? A guest house with a vagrant and his child?" Madison's jaw tightened. "Lower your voice. Noah's here." "I don't care about Noah," Richard snapped. "I care about you, about my daughter throwing away her life for a man with nothing. Do you understand what people are saying? Do you understand what you're risking?" Ethan froze in the kitchen doorway, towel clenched in his hand. He should have walked away, should have let them fight their war without him, but the words held him captive. Richard pressed on, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You're putting everything on the line, your reputation, your future, your inheritance. For what? For a man who can't even give you a roof without your charity? Is this what you want your name tied to?" Madison's hands trembled, but she didn't step back. "He saved me," she said. Richard scoffed. "He pulled you out of a river, and you mistake it for destiny. Gratitude is one thing. Destroying yourself for it is another." "It isn't gratitude," she snapped, her voice rising now. "It's love." The word cracked through the room, hanging between them like a flare in the dark. Ethan felt it strike deep, a weight that both lifted and crushed. Richard's face hardened. "Then hear me clearly. If you keep him, you lose everything else. No inheritance, no protection, no name left untarnished. Walk away from him now, or you walk away from me forever." Silence followed, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. Madison's chest rose and fell, each breath steadying her like a climber gripping a ledge. Her father's ultimatum was ironclad, designed to break her. But when she spoke, her voice carried a resolve that made her tremble only once. "If love cost me money," she whispered, "then money was never worth it." Richard stared at her, disbelief flashing into rage. He turned sharply, coat flaring, and stormed out into the night. The door slammed, rattling the frame. The sound of tires on gravel faded until only the fire remained, flickering weakly against the silence he left behind. Ethan stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, his chest tight, his throat burning. He had heard every word. Madison had chosen him over everything she had ever known: wealth, security, a future written in stone. And instead of filling him with joy, it broke him, because deep down he didn't believe he was worth it. She deserved more than him, more than a man who carried scars from war, shame from failure, and a son who deserved a world brighter than he could provide. Madison had stood in front of her father, a titan of industry, and thrown away her fortune for him, and Ethan couldn't let her do it. Later that night, when Madison sat beside Noah's bed, brushing his hair gently as he drifted to sleep, Ethan lingered by the window, staring into the snow. He could already feel the decision settling in his bones. He couldn't let her lose everything for him. He couldn't let Noah grow up watching his father drag someone else down. He turned back toward the room, watching Madison's face softened by the lamplight, watching Noah breathe evenly in the safety of her presence. His heart ached with something too big for words. He loved them both, but love, he decided, meant knowing when to leave. And so, as the night deepened, Ethan began to plan his escape. The morning began quietly, the kind of silence that seemed almost kind at first. Snow lay heavy on the grounds outside the guest house, muffling the world into a hushed white. Madison stirred awake in the small bedroom she had claimed for herself, expecting the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the low hum of Ethan's voice as he coaxed Noah into breakfast. But the house was still. Too still. She rose quickly, pulling a sweater around her shoulders, and padded barefoot down the short hall. The kitchen was empty, no steaming coffee, no bread waiting to be sliced. The couch where Ethan had sometimes fallen asleep sat untouched, its blanket folded neatly across the back. Noah's door was cracked, and she pushed it open, relief flooding her for a moment at the sight of him, still asleep, tangled in blankets, his hair sticking up in unruly tufts. But even that comfort soured when she noticed the envelope propped against the lamp by the door, her name, written in Ethan's rough, careful handwriting. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The paper was thin, the ink pressed too hard into the fibers. She unfolded it once, and the words cut her open. "Thank you for reminding me what love feels like. But you deserve someone who can stand beside you without shame. Take care of Noah. He deserves the world." That was all. No signature, no explanation, just a farewell wrapped in guilt. Madison's breath hitched. Her knees gave out, and she sank against the doorframe, the paper crumpling in her fist. For all the storms she had weathered, corporate wars, headlines, her father's endless demands, nothing had ever undone her like this. Noah woke to the sound of her sob. He sat up, eyes still clouded with sleep, but when he saw her face, panic set in. "Where's Dad?" His voice was small, desperate. Madison couldn't bring herself to answer at first. She pulled him into her arms, holding him close as he pressed against her chest. "He's gone, isn't he?" Noah whispered, his voice breaking. When she finally nodded, his small body shuddered, and the sobs came, raw and loud, shaking the walls of the little house. Madison rocked him, tears streaking her own cheeks, whispering words she wasn't sure she believed. "It's not your fault." "It's not. He loves you. He doesn't know how to stay." The boy clung to her like she was the last solid thing in a world crumbling under his feet. By midday, the news reached Richard. He arrived unannounced, of course, the smugness already carved into his expression. He stood in the doorway, surveying the scene. Noah curled on the couch with red eyes, Madison pale and worn from crying, and he allowed himself a cruel smile. "I warned you," he said simply. "I told you he'd drag you down. He left you both. That's what men like him do." Madison's head snapped up. She rose slowly, her father's arrogance igniting something fierce inside her. "Stop!" The word came out sharp, commanding. Richard blinked, unused to her tone. "He made his choice," Richard continued, undeterred. "Now it's time for you to make yours. Come home. Reclaim your name, your future. Enough of this charity fantasy." But Madison's eyes burned, steady with a conviction she hadn't seen in her before. She shook her head. "You think this is over? You think you've won because he walked away?" Her hand tightened around the crumpled note still clutched in her fist. "No, this isn't the end. You don't decide my story, and neither does he." Richard frowned, his confidence faltering just slightly. "Madison—" "I'm not coming back to marble floors and empty rooms," she cut in. "I'm not trading truth for comfort. If he's out there drowning in shame, then I'll find him. And when I do, I'll remind him of what he gave me, of what he gave us both." She glanced at Noah, whose tear-stained cheeks lifted just slightly at her words. Her father exhaled, exasperated, but the edge of his smirk wavered. "You sound like a fool." Madison straightened, her voice low but steady. "No, I sound like someone who finally knows what love is worth. And it isn't your money." Richard left then, silence trailing behind him like smoke. Madison stood in the doorway long after his car disappeared down the drive, the cold air biting her skin, the note still pressed tight in her hand. Her heart was broken, but not defeated. Ethan thought leaving would save her. What he didn't know was that Madison Ward had never been the kind of woman to let fate or fear decide the ending. The city swallowed her whole, but Madison refused to disappear. She traded silk coats for wool, heels for boots, and the glow of chandeliers for the dim light of street lamps. Every morning she left the estate before dawn, hair tied back, her driver ordered to keep the car blocks away so she could walk unshadowed. She searched alleyways where men slept curled against steam grates, ducked into shelters where the air was thick with coughs and old coffee, and stood in line at soup kitchens that smelled of boiled potatoes and weary hope. At first people stared, unable to reconcile the heiress from the papers with the woman holding out her hand to the forgotten. Reporters caught on quickly. They trailed her with cameras and microphones, asking why she was here, why she was doing this. She didn't answer them. She wasn't searching for publicity, she was searching for him. But the images spread anyway. Madison Ward, her expensive coat dusted with snow, crouched on a sidewalk speaking to a man who hadn't been called by his name in months. The city whispered. Some mocked her, others admired her. And slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Volunteers joined her at shelters. College students carried lanterns and blankets, combing through parks and train stations. A retired teacher began making lists of names, trying to reconnect people with families who'd lost them. Madison hadn't meant to start anything larger than her own desperate search, but her determination caught like fire. Her father called it madness. The world called it a movement. Days bled into nights. She barely slept, surviving on lukewarm coffee and grit. Each time she thought she might find him, she found only shadows, men with tired eyes who shook their heads when she showed his photo. Yet she didn't give up. Somewhere in the noise of the city, Ethan was breathing, cold and alone, convinced he was doing her a kindness by vanishing. That thought kept her walking, step after step, even when her legs trembled and her voice grew hoarse from asking. On the fifth night, snow fell again, soft and relentless, coating the streets in a thin white sheet. Madison pulled her scarf tighter, breath fogging in the air. Reporters had stopped following her so closely, worn down by the monotony, but a few lingered, their cameras clicking in the distance. She ignored them. Her eyes scanned the bridges as she moved along the river, the water glinting black under the streetlights. And then she saw him. He was huddled beneath the same iron bridge where everything had begun, his back against the frozen stone, his jacket pulled tight across his chest. His head was bowed, his hands tucked under his arms for warmth. Snow gathered in his hair, his shoulders, as though even the sky had given up on him. Madison's breath caught, her heart seizing in her chest. For a moment she couldn't move, afraid the vision would vanish if she blinked. Then she stepped forward, her boots crunching in the snow. "Ethan!" His head jerked up, eyes wide, dazed from cold and exhaustion. For a heartbeat, he didn't believe it was her. She looked wrong here, too radiant, too fierce for a world of shadows. But her voice, trembling yet unshaken, cut through the disbelief. She dropped to her knees in front of him, ignoring the damp seeping through her coat. Her hands reached for his face, cupping it gently, her thumbs brushing away the flakes that clung to his skin. His eyes were glassy, a mixture of shame and shock, but beneath it all, recognition. "You found me," he whispered, his voice raw. "I never stopped looking," she said. Her words were steady, her eyes blazing with the kind of determination no winter could freeze. Behind them, cameras flashed, the moment captured before it could slip away. But Madison didn't notice. For her, the world had shrunk to one man beneath a bridge, the man who had once pulled her from a river and now needed her to pull him from himself. And for the first time since he left, Ethan let himself breathe. Snow clung to the hem of Madison's coat as she lowered herself to the frozen ground. The bridge loomed overhead, steel bones creaking faintly against the winter wind, but she didn't notice the cold or the reporters lingering at a distance with their cameras. All she saw was Ethan, hollow-eyed, his body curled into itself, his jacket pulled so tightly it looked like he was trying to disappear inside it. He wouldn't meet her gaze at first, his chin tucked to his chest, his shame louder than any words. She didn't lecture him. She didn't ask why. She didn't beg him to explain the note he had left behind or the nights of searching that had hollowed her eyes. Instead, she simply knelt beside him, the gravel biting through the fabric of her clothes, and reached for his hand. Her fingers slipped into his, warm against the trembling chill of his skin. He startled at the contact but didn't pull away. "I don't need saving," she whispered, her voice steady but soft enough that it belonged only to him. "I just need you." The words cracked through the frost that had built around his heart. He lifted his head then, eyes wet, lips parting like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the strength. Years of guilt, of loss, of being told he wasn't enough, had carved into him so deeply that staying felt more dangerous than leaving. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak there was another sound, a small, desperate cry. "Dad!" Noah's voice rang out, breaking across the cold air. The boy darted forward from the cluster of volunteers and onlookers, his little boots slipping in the snow. He launched himself into Ethan's lap, arms circling his father's neck with all the force of someone terrified the world might take him away again. His tears pressed hot into Ethan's skin. "Don't leave again, Dad. Please, don't." Ethan froze, every muscle taut, his arms hovering, like he wasn't sure he had the right to hold his own child. But Noah clung tighter, his small body shaking. "You promised. You said it was us against everything. Don't go." That was the breaking point. Ethan's chest cracked open, every wall he had built collapsing in an instant. His arms wrapped around his son, pulling him close, burying his face in Noah's hair as sobs tore out of him unbidden. Years of silence, of holding it all in, shattered under the weight of a child's plea. He wept, not from weakness, but from the release of carrying too much for too long. Madison stayed beside them, her hand still wrapped around his. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence was enough, anchoring him to the moment, reminding him that love didn't demand worthiness, it demanded only presence. Ethan lifted his face, streaked with tears, and looked at her. For the first time, he let her see all of it, the grief that had haunted him since Rachel's death, the shame of failing to provide, the exhaustion of surviving in shadows. And in her eyes he saw none of the judgment he had feared, only a quiet, unwavering truth. Love wasn't about being deserving, it wasn't about money or legacy or perfection, it was about showing up, even when you were broken, especially when you were broken. He held Noah tighter, his hand still entwined with Madison's, and he understood. He didn't have to be enough by himself. He didn't have to keep running from the people who had already chosen him. All he had to do was stay, and for the first time he chose to. The guest house had changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. The air smelled less of cedar and dust now, more of warm bread, old books, and the faint metallic hum of piano keys. Months had passed since the night under the bridge, but the memory lived in everything they built together. A used keyboard sat against the wall, its plastic edges chipped, its power cord taped in places where it had frayed. Madison had found it at a thrift shop, carried it home herself, and declared it perfect. Ethan sat at the keyboard with Noah perched beside him, their shoulders brushing as his calloused fingers guided the boy's smaller ones across the keys. The sound was uneven, hesitant, but filled with earnest determination. "See?" Ethan said softly. "Doesn't matter if you miss a note. You keep playing. That's how you find the song." Noah giggled when he struck the wrong chord, his laughter brighter than any melody, and Ethan joined in, his voice lighter than it had been in years. Madison sat cross-legged on the couch nearby, barefoot, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. An open book rested in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. She was too busy watching them, the two figures framed in the soft lamplight, the music, if it could be called that, filling the room with a rhythm more honest than anything she'd ever heard at a gala. Every so often Noah would glance back at her, grinning, and she would grin too, as if the three of them shared a secret no one else could understand. Later, when the lessons ended and Noah's eyes grew heavy, Madison shifted onto the rug with him, curling against the pillows as she read aloud. Her voice softened the edges of the words, wrapping them around him like another blanket. Ethan leaned in the doorway, arms folded, watching them, his chest aching with a fullness he couldn't name. The boy who had once clutched him in fear was drifting to sleep to the sound of stories, safe and certain. The woman who had once belonged to marble halls and endless boardrooms now looked more at home on a worn carpet, her hair tousled, her bare feet tucked beneath her. One evening, the crunch of tires on gravel signaled a visitor. Richard Ward stepped out of a black car, his figure sharp against the dusk. His pride had not left him, but it was thinner now, tempered by something humbler. He entered the guest house cautiously, his eyes scanning the small space that had become their home. He found Madison first, standing in the kitchen, with a dish towel slung over her shoulder. She didn't speak, only lifted her chin in greeting. He found Noah next, seated at the keyboard, plunking out a halting tune with concentration, and then he found Ethan, sitting quietly by the window, not defensive, not apologetic, just present. For a long moment Richard said nothing. Then his gaze landed on the drawing taped to the wall above the fireplace. Crayons on white paper, lines uneven but heartfelt. 3 figures holding hands beneath a bridge. But the bridge was no longer cast in shadow. Noah had drawn it glowing, beams of yellow radiating outward like a sunrise. Richard's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. His shoulders sagged just a fraction, and for the first time he looked at Ethan not as a threat to his empire, but as a man who had somehow built something his money never could. Family. That night, after Richard left with fewer words than he had ever spoken in his life, the house grew quiet again. Ethan sat beside Madison on the couch, the soft murmur of Noah's breathing drifting in from the next room. He stared at the sketch on the wall, his throat tightening. "I thought I was drowning that night," he whispered, his voice rough but steady. "Turns out I was learning how to breathe again." Madison turned her face toward him, her eyes shining with tears. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "And now," she said, her voice breaking into a smile, "we all finally get to live." Ethan exhaled, leaning his forehead against hers. The fire flickered low, the drawing on the wall glowed in the lamplight, and for the first time there was no trace of the river's pull, no shadow of running, only warmth, only love, only home. If this story touched you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because more stories of love, resilience, and second chances are coming, and you won't want to miss them.